was up for it here as well. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, then let's continue on with our look at the First World War, particularly the United States' involvement in this conflict. We ended, I think, with this slide last time. What I've been trying to do is to get a sense of how it is after 3 years of conflict that the United States finally gets involved in this war. Again, we don't join the war until April of 1917, 3 years after this war has been waged. Right? And again, just to kind of get a sense of this, you know, for 3 years, the federal government, the president's been saying no, we're not getting involved, right? So there is this, and that, by the way, was a majority opinion of American citizens. Again, just go back to the election of 1916. Wilson was re-elected under the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." Again, it's a slim majority, but it's still the best evidence we have to suggest that this war in the United States, from the perspective of Americans, it's not a popular war. We're not interested in fighting this war, right? And you have this whole tide going no, 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 and then suddenly we're going to go against that tide. That's going to create a tremendous backlash in the United States itself, right? And we're going to look at that part of it after we get the war up and running and look at the peace conference and things like that. So I'll come back and look at these domestic issues. But just sort of keep that in mind. This was not a popular war from the average American's perspective. This was a European conflict, something we don't want to be involved in. Right? Notice that you're going to have a draft in the First World War. You don't really have to have drafts during popular wars. That Spanish-American War, President McKinley asked for 100,000 volunteers. He got 1 million. No draft, popular war. This war, not so much. Right? So we'll come back to that in just a moment here. But part of that is the fact that there's this tide for 3 years, no to the war. We're going to reverse that tide. Okay, so we briefly looked at some of the cultural sympathies and connections between England and the United States. One of the reasons that we eventually side on the English. This distrust with Germany, particularly that Zimmermann telegram, however we interpret that, clearly indicated something was up with Germany, right? I think that Wilson, as an Anglophile, intended to discount the German parliamentary system as a military dictatorship. Also is going to cast distrust on the part of the Germans, right? The Germans appear to be the aggressors in this conflict. I don't think that's necessarily accurate. They did throw the first punch. If we want to, technically, yeah, they did throw the first. They invaded Belgium to get to France, but they only did so because Russia is mobilizing. If they don't mobilize, they're going to get caught, right? So again, it was this. It's more about competition, not exactly who is to blame here. Everybody's going to be to blame, but that's not how wars work, right? Eventually, the winners get to decide who is at fault, right? And as I said, Germany's going to lose this war. This war, this particular slide here, I was trying to indicate that Germany, they reversed their submarine warfare policy, and they announced that they will attack any ship. Every ship headed to England is fair game because they know they can't outlast the Allies because the Allies have unlimited supplies coming from the United States. And they are fighting two wars, basically, between the Russians on the Eastern Front and the British and the French on the Western Front. So they announced this submarine warfare with the hope that it will disrupt all of those supply lines, settle the war in the east against Russia, which we're going to talk about today, and then bring those troops from the east to the west, launch a massive assault on France, and win the war before the United States can actually get involved. They failed to do this, right? As we indicated, they're going to lose this conflict. But that's what the German gamble was all about, and this was a gamble that did not pay. Okay, so we've looked at three reasons, main reasons here. I want to consider a fourth reason, particularly in the mind of Wilson here, his vision for restructuring international politics. And this is Wilson's liberal world order. Right? Wilson is a Democrat, but he's also, more importantly, a liberal in a classical sense of the word, not a modern sense. Our understanding of liberals and their understanding of two different things. Okay, so this is when I'm using the word liberal world order. I'm not thinking of modern sort of liberal wing of the Democratic Party, but classical liberal. And I'll try to explain what that means as we go. But I think in many ways, remember, Wilson is an academic. He's an intellectual. And he has to kind of wrap his head around this whole thing before he can go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. He's very hesitant to get involved in this, but eventually he's going to come around on this, right? So what is his vision, right? Well, he gives a speech in 1917 where he outlines and sort of announces to the world his very famous 14 points plan, right? These are 14 points that he would like implemented in the peace conference whenever this war is ended, right? There will be negotiations, how to settle the war itself, but also to a certain extent, how to implement new policies in the aftermath of the war. And he wants to implement a plan that's going to, if it's implemented, absolutely restructure international political relations, right? Now, I'm not going to go through every point in this plan. I don't think that's necessary. But I do want to go through maybe 5 or 6 of them just so you can get a sense of what he's trying to do here. And ultimately, in trying to implement this plan, it's going to mean you got to get involved in the war. Because if you're not involved in the war, you will not be involved in the peace talks afterwards, right? Now, we'll get to that in just a moment. But what is his vision? That's what we want to think about. And I do think that Wilson, again, I kind of tend to be hard on Wilson, but he is one of the true visionary presidents here. The big picture he definitely has in mind. So one of the points he makes, he wants to spread self-determination or implement policies of self-rule. Now, what this basically means is sort of little d democratic elements in governments around the world, right? People around the world should have a say in how they are governed, right? Again, a major American principle, consent of the governed. I wouldn't necessarily say big D, democracy, but little d, that is, people get a say, they get a vote, they get an opinion. It's not just about colonial rule and imperialism, right? So self-determination, people get to determine for themselves the type of government and society they have. Okay? Now, this one's, again, we've already talked about this. He reissues Freedom of the Seas, but what he is saying here from a commercial perspective is that in times of war, particularly, neutral nations should have the right to trade with whomever they want. Because they're neutral, right? So this was the doctrine he initiated at the beginning of the war in declaring American neutrality, and he re-emphasizes it here. So this was an important one to him. And again, notice what it's really speaking of here is economic freedom is what he's really talking about, right? Eliminate all barriers to international trade or international investment. All right, now this one's kind of complicated, and this is where he really gets into aspects of classical liberalism, because a classical liberal, just think of that word, where does the word liberal come from? It comes from to liberate, right? And in this instance, what he's talking about is liberating economies or economic barriers that prevent or reduce trade around the world, right? So this has a kind of a domestic as well as an international consequence, okay? Let's consider the domestic side of this. That is from domestically within the United States. One of the policies that the Republicans always support, if you are a Republican, you absolutely supported high protective tariffs. This was an excessive, now, and again, tariffs are normal. There's nothing wrong with tariffs. There's a certain amount of protectionism involved there. But what makes it a high tariff is that you put a very high, excessively high tax on foreign goods imports coming into the United States. The point is to encourage Americans to buy domestic products to help big business who is bankrolling the Republican Party, all right? Now, that's not necessarily corrupt or anything like that. That's just business and politics working together here. But the Republicans all supported high protective tariffs. Well, Wilson's not a Republican. He's a Democrat. And while he is president, he actually lowered the protective tariffs. So he is calling for a dramatic reduction of protective tariffs that will, continue beyond his presidency. And how is it that lower protective tariffs would eliminate a barrier to international trade? Well, consider what the new diplomacy is all about. Access to foreign markets. If you tax foreign products excessively high, what are those countries going to turn right around and do? They're going to do the exact same thing. They're going to tax American manufactured goods excessively high in retaliation. So again, high protective tariffs really fly in the face of the new diplomacy, because if you want your goods in foreign markets, you need to keep your tariffs low so that other countries will do the same, keep their tariffs low, right? Now, interestingly enough, he's going to implement low protective tariffs during his presidency, but in the 1920s, when the Republicans kind of get their act together and come back and dominate for the next generation, record high protective tariffs again, right? So that's a Republican policy. He's advocating lower protective tariffs, okay? That's a domestic issue, but it gets us into other countries' markets because their tariffs will be lower and not tax our products so high. Now, he really goes out on a limb with this one. He's calling for an end to colonialism and imperial control of colonial economies. I just think what this age was. This is the age of imperialism. This was that scramble for Africa where European, particularly the English and the Germans, but the French, the Dutch, the Belgians to some degree are there. This was where we were scrambling. Again, Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, Philippines. We are acquiring territory. Asia, China, right? South Pacific Islands. So he's calling for an end to colonialism because the purpose of a colony is to provide a guaranteed closed market for the mother country. So you extract wealth and resources from a colony, turn it into manufactured goods, and then sell it back to that colony. And is there any kind of competition in colonial economies? No. The whole point is to keep everybody out. It's your territory. You possess it. You control it. It's a closed economy. What he's saying here is that if you can end colonialism, end imperialism, you will liberate all of these closed colonial economies. And by definition, then, this will allow the American manufactured goods to access into those markets, right? Now, this is a very interesting and very controversial proposal here, because what about our colonies, right? What about our territories? What about our possessions? He's kind of vague about exactly what that means, right? So again, this is really, from spreading U.S. interest is what he's interested in doing here, and influence. But to some extent, this will be the biggest problem with all of these points here, is that he's kind of vague in how you actually implement them, right? He's an idea kind of guy. He's not so much a detail kind of guy. But again, he's calling for an end to anything that is going to eliminate or be a barrier for economic investment abroad. Okay? He is calling for an overall reduction of the military armaments or military arms, weapons, right? Europe, as we talked about already, this was the first major industrialized war with all kinds of new weapons and weapons technology, tremendous amount of money being made in the manufacturing and selling of weapons, just like today, right? I think we spend more money on military than the entire world combined, right? So this is a big business here. But the problem with the military is that if you create war machines, you end up using them, right? So he is calling for just a reduction overall in the availability of weapons here to try to ease some of the tensions and likelihood that people will end up using them. He also calls for an end to secret diplomacy. Now, this was also one of the problems with World War I, that sort of domino effect here, where when one country became threatened, it triggered treaties that they had with other countries, and not everybody knew exactly who had alliances with whom, right? So when one treaty got activated, because again, the Serbians were threatened by the Austro-Hungarians, this brings in the Russians, this brings in the Germans, right? That sort of back and forth, back and forth. So what he's basically saying here is, let's lay this all on the table and know who is on whose side here, so that if I know you have an alliance with these three countries, I might not attack you, I might not threaten you, right? So he said, the phrase was, open covenants, agreements, arrived at openly, right? Let's know who is on whose sides here. But the most important one, the centerpiece of all of these points, is this last one here, the League of Nations. The League of Nations. Now, Wilson is the architect of the League of Nations. This is his creation. And yes, this is the predecessor of today's United Nations. Okay? So what he's calling for here is an international organization created to try and maintain and establish, or to prevent future conflicts by maintaining peaceful relations here. And the key to this, there are many aspects of the League of Nations, but the key to it is a concept called collective security. Collective security. Now, what does this mean? What it means is you open up membership into the League of Nations to anybody that wants to join. Okay? So, again, this is to take it beyond national concerns and put this on an international level. Right? Again, remember this whole point is to reshape international relationships. So, everybody that wants to join the League is welcome to join the League. And the purpose of it in terms of collective security is that if any country threatens any member of the League of Nations, any member nation, the rest of the League is going to do what? Come to the defense of that one country. Collectively, they will provide security. All right? So if I'm an aggressor nation and I'm threatening my neighbor, but I know that as a member of the League of Nations, every other country is supposed to come to their aid, might I rethink becoming aggressive? Right? Absolutely. That's the point. Now that works in theory. That's more of a theory than a practical. There are other sort of factors we have to consider here. Particularly, well, what if they're both members of the League of Nations? Right? Well, then that's a little sticky situation there, right? But you can get the sense of the idea here is that we're all in this together. Let's come to the aid of a nation that might be threatened in order, and the purpose to prevent future conflicts. That's what the League of Nations is all about. Okay? Whether it works or not, its effectiveness, again, it's not even implemented yet, but that's to be determined, right? But you can get a sense here that he's really talking about some pretty bold initiatives here. And by the way, how do you think a lot of these European nations are going to feel about this stuff, right? You think England's interested in ending colonialism? I don't think so, right? So, yeah, freedom of the seas. Again, England is not interested in violating people's neutrality, but if it's in their own national interest to make sure the United States is not trading with Germany, then they're going to do it, right? So this is the problem here, is that Wilson is an internationalist. And everybody else that's going to eventually come to the peace conference, he's really the only one there that's an international. Everybody else is a nationalist, meaning they have their own nation's agenda at hand. That's much more important, right? And this is going to be one of the problems. So he's really kind of going up against, a lot of the authority and the power and tradition of these colonial powers, these imperial powers here, right? Now, again, this is just an idea. None of this has been implemented here, but this is his vision. This is what he's trying to do, okay? Now, why does he embrace this vision, right? And particularly, why, when he goes out to the American people and tries to sell this plan, he can present it a number of ways to the American people, but he's ultimately trying to get the American people to embrace this, okay? Well, the problem is, if he went out and told the American people how this will benefit us specifically, right? Again, if he focused on a national interest, just sort of think about it, right? Again, if you create political systems of self-government and self-rule and self-determination, those are inherently American values, because it is still, again, however you implement it, democratic, all right? So he's talking about political reform in the image or based upon the model of the United States. And if you recreate governments in the image of the United States is going to have influence, all right? National interest. Economically, if you went to the American people and said, look, if we lower all these protective tariffs and end imperialism, it will create economic opportunity and jobs because we will get access to more markets, there will be demand for our product, demand for jobs, better wages. That is, if he appealed to people from their day-to-day concerns of jobs and homes and security, people can connect to that kind of stuff. They can see the big picture here because it relates to their specific their reality, right? Wilson doesn't do this. He's bad at this because he doesn't sort of look at it from a national perspective. He looks at it from an idealistic perspective. And again, remember, he's a professor. We kind of get caught up in this stuff, right? He is an idealist. He's not a realist. That's a bad way to say that. Idealists are still realists. It's just they believe that ideas are the most real, right? As opposed to more material, right? But what I mean by his idealism is he goes out there and says, remember the big phrase that we'll have to definitely come back to, right? But one of the key phrases that comes out of the First World War is Wilson claimed, why are we going to join this war? What is our goal? To make the world safe for democracy. Now he's talking about changing the world. He's talking about implementing plans to create peace and harmony and to get everybody to get along, right? He's out there to promote this agenda that will restructure international politics and relationships so that we have a much more peaceful world in the future. Now, these are all very, noble ideas, but they're ideas that most people can't wrap their heads around. We are not out to save the world. We're not out to change the world. We're concerned about our jobs and paying our bills and making sure garbage gets collected, right? Those kind of practical day-to-day concerns. So when he goes out there to, hey, we're going to change the world, he sets the bar so high, what our goals are, that it's going to be impossible to actually achieve them. Most people are going to be much, again, well, from a practical level, be down here on their local daily concerns, right? So the problem here is he doesn't know how, or he's not good at, connecting the overall agenda in terms of how the average American will benefit if we get involved in this conflict. He's no good at that, okay? Again, there are practical things he could emphasize. He just didn't do it. Okay. Now, how does this vision, trying to implement the 14 points plan, how does this justify actually entering into the war? Right? Well, he gave another, lots of speeches here. He gave this is one you should know for sure. It's a famous Peace Without Victory speech, 1917. This is early 1917. This is before we get involved in the war, obviously. And this is a speech that he directed or addressed to the European nations fighting this war. And you get a sense, just from the title, you get a sense of where he's going, what the goal is. He is basically suggesting that we have a ceasefire, everybody stop shooting, let's declare peace, and not worry about who actually won. Right? That is, he is calling for peace without a declared victor in the war. Right? He's in essence, again, back to the idealism, hoping that people would just stop fighting. All right. Now think about how this is going to be received by the European nations. You're Germany, you're Russia, you're England, you're France. You've been dying. You've sacrificed an entire generation of young men. You are in debt to the United States. You have destroyed your economy. You have destroyed your infrastructure. Literally hundreds of thousands of young men have died from each of these countries. This sort of sacrifice, this kind of loss. And you want us to just stop fighting and not consider who won? What country is going to respond to that? Nobody's going to respond to that, right? They throw that right back in his face and say, easy for you to say, you're sitting over here on the sideline profiteering from this whole war. No thank you, right? And they continue to fight, obviously. But notice it's really important, the rejection of the Peace Without Victory speech here to Wilson. Because what he instantly learned is that he has no credibility with the Europeans, none. Now, we're very important economically because we are supplying their war machine, but politically, diplomatically, he has no credibility. And if he wants to implement the 14 points plan, where does he have to be? He has to be at the peace talks when this war is over. That's the only way. Well, how is he going to have a credible seat at the peace talks? You have to get involved in this war. You're going to have to sacrifice, and you're going to have to get dirty, and you're going to have to spill blood to have a credible seat at the negotiation tables when this war is over. It's the only way. So if you want to implement this vision, You're going to have to get involved in the war. Okay? Okay, now all of this stuff is kind of circulating in his head when something really important happens in Russia. This is a very famous Russian Revolution, takes place in 1917. Right? Now this guy here is the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. This is of the famous Romanov family. Nicholas himself is not a, how do we say this? It's very interesting too. He's actually cousins with the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, right? Again, these sort of family relations and stuff. And I believe they're also related to the King of England at this time as well. So again, this kind of infighting here. Nicholas II is not particularly fond of war. He's not one of these sort of military dictator sort of individuals. He certainly sort of looks like it with his uniform, but they all dress in uniforms like this. But Russia is involved in this war. This war is incredibly unpopular to the Russian people, right? As we saw their lack of supplies going into combat last time. Russia is losing huge numbers of people. When this war is over, nobody will have lost more than them. So this war is not particularly popular, but the problem is once you're involved in these wars, it's very easy or very difficult to just quit. You can't just back out. Right? This is a very difficult situation that the Russians find themselves in here. All right? So he's not particularly popular either, as you can imagine. And ultimately, he decides, in a very unusual decision here, he decides to quit. Not quit the war, quit being the Tsar. Right? And he abdicates the throne. He leaves. He's done. He quits. It's not always good to be the king. Okay? And interestingly enough, he tried to get his brother to take over. His brother doesn't want this job, right? This is a difficult situation here. Now, again, he did get himself into this to a certain extent, but again, he's got the Russian military having a lot of influence as well. So he quits. Okay. Now, what we're about to have is a revolution in Russia. But be real clear about this. This is not necessarily a revolution where one group overthrew the existing government. As I just said, he quit. There is a vacuum of power. That is, his abdication of the throne is what creates the situation for a revolution to take place. Okay? Now, we've probably heard something about the Russian Revolution in 1917, but there are, in fact, two revolutions in 1917. The first one takes place in February of 1917, early in the year. Right? The big one is later in October, but this is the first one here. And in the absence of the Tsar, in the absence of real power, and this vacuum created, a provisional government sort of pulls itself together enough to take over and establish authority. But this government, this provisional government, is incredibly weak. They're barely hanging on. Now, they are promising democracy, or at least some democratic aspects. They're promising real reform, but after the war. They are still advocating staying in this war. Makes them very unpopular with the average Russian citizen. All right? Now, notice the date of this, February 1917. Here's Wilson. This was the last little piece he needed because we're about to declare war on Germany. Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare in February of 1917, largely due to what's now happening in Russia, because it looks like Russia is about to collapse. There's obviously massive internal problems, and Russia was not doing well to begin with, but it looks like things are about to fall apart in Russia, which the Germans then believe is their opportunity to shift forces from the Eastern Front over to the Western Front, launch that offensive, disrupt that American trade, and try to win the war. Right? So remember, these things are all connected here. Wilson is also becoming much more convinced that it's, from an idealistic perspective, he can get Congress to declare war on Germany because Russia is on the verge of falling out of this war anyways, and most importantly, the Tsar is no longer in charge. Now, here's what Wilson wants to say. he wants to make this, again, an idealistic conflict about making the world safe for democracy. He wants to shape this war in a contest between democracy, allies, against dictatorship, Germany. But he can't do that as long as the Tsar was around, because the Tsar, this is a dictator. This is a military dictatorship, right? Again, wherever he went, but the Tsar, he's not, I mean, again, he himself is not, this sort of militaristic guy, but he's a monarch. He's a king. He's more dictatorship than William II was in Germany, absolutely. So Wilson never could make this argument, democracy against dictatorship, if a dictator is on his side as an ally, because the Russians were on the Allied side, right? Well, that's not the case any longer. The Tsar's gone. He promising democratic reform. This is now going to be an easier case. I mean, it's a flimsy case, but he can make the case that it's democracy versus dictatorship. And remember, that's that intellectual piece of the puzzle that he needs to wrap his head around before he can go to Congress and ask for a declaration. All right. Now, they're advocating here a policy of staying in the war, and when the war is over, we will consider economic, political, democratic reform. Okay? Well, you can imagine that this is not going to be very popular to the Russian people. And this government is under pressure immediately, not so much from the Germans, although they're still fighting on the Eastern Front, Germany's Eastern Front, but they're under pressure from another group of Russians. These are the Bolsheviks. Now, long story short, the Bolsheviks, we can just say these are the communists, right? Not quite that simple, but that's ultimately what's going to happen here, right? The Bolsheviks are led by a man named Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin was what he's really good at, he's a revolutionary. That's what he's good at. I mean, he's an agitator, right? He stirs up problems and takes advantage of problems, right? He's been calling for a revolution in Russia for years. So much so that he'd actually been kicked out of Russia. He'd been exiled many times. Many years ago. He was actually in Sweden for a while. He's in London for a while. He's in Germany for a while. The Germans knew exactly what to do with him in 1917. They put him on a train straight to Moscow. Get him back in there and let him stir up problems in Russia because of two things. One, stir up problems in Russia, but two, the problem here is that he's advocating what ultimately becomes known as communism. Right? And obviously it's going to be a major issue in the 20th century. We'll keep coming back to this. But communism was considered by the capitalist West as a disease, as a germ, as a plague, as a contagion. And if you can put this disease, like Vladimir Lenin, back into Russia, it will spread. Right? And it will cause all kinds of problems there. But most importantly, you don't want it spreading in Germany, or London, or Paris, or in the capitalist West. Right? So they send him back on a non-stop train to Moscow, getting him out of Germany and hopefully causing problems in Russia, which is exactly what he did. Now, very interestingly, again, disease, plague, germs, however you want to say that, he's very popular in Russia. because what his number one policy? Get out of this war, in this war. He is advocating for Russia to quit this war, and the Russian people want that more than anything else. So he's very popular. And ultimately, he and his ideology is going to take over in October of 1917 and establish down the road the Communist Soviet Union. All right? Now, they haven't done that yet. This is just the beginning of that, 1917. And what's happening here is that in October of 1917, Russia's out of the war. They quit. They left. And it now turns in Russia as a civil war for the next couple of years, a very bloody, violent civil war against what sometimes, again, we like to color code these things, right? The communists, they are the Reds, right? This democratic government here, speaking of purity or whatever, right? They are the whites. So it's the white army in Russia against the red army in Russia, right? Now, one little side note here. I just want you to. I'll mention this later, but it happens right now in 1917 into 1918. You know, when this war is not this war, but when the Second World War is over, and the Cold War is going to begin, which is an ideological conflict between communism and capitalism, not democracy, but capitalism. The Soviet Union at that time, this is Russia, but the Communist Soviet Union, they're going to remember something that happened right now in 1917, and that is this. The United States and Great Britain sent 25,000 troops into Russia to defeat Lenin, to make sure, or at least attempt to make sure, that this communist revolution was never successful, that it failed. All right? So we actually invaded Russia. Now, again, we sent 10,000 troops, the British 15,000, so it's not a major force. But think about it this way. How do you think the Russian people are going to feel about the United States and England invading their country to prevent their very existence, to prevent them from ever establishing their country, the Soviet Union? You think they're going to remember that? Absolutely. How many Americans knew that we did that? None, or almost none, right? We don't talk about those kinds of things. But remember, when we get to the Cold War, communism versus capitalism, we're going to have to consider both perspectives here. And there are illegitimate but legitimate reasons why the Soviets don't trust us. Here's one of them. We invaded their country. How would we feel if somebody had invaded us at the time of our revolution to prevent us from being successful? Think we'd forget about that? Of course we wouldn't forget. So we invaded their country to try to prevent them from being successful. Now this failed miserably, and ultimately Lenin goes on to establish the Soviet Union, the Communist Soviet Union. We'll come back to that later. All right? But here's the point. Russia is out of the war, as the United States is about to come into the war. Okay. Now, I'm not a military, so I'm not going through all the battles. The war itself came to a conclusion in 1918. In November, actually, of 1918. The Germans lost, and now we have to settle the aftermath of the war. Okay? In fact, you may hear of the phrase that the war itself actually came to a conclusion on November 11th, 1918. And the phrase is, in the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, we had peace in our time. Right? So it's called Armistice Day. A ceasefire was established. And the Germans particularly agreed to a ceasefire because of, or agreeing to Wilson's 14 points plan. That's what they were agreeing to. That's what they were hoping would be implemented, because it would obviously be more favorable to them in the long run, right? Well, that's to be determined whether that plan will be followed. Okay? Now, the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. This is the peace conference that's going to decide the aftermath of the First World War. All right? The Allies won. Germany lost. It's an interesting question. The German people don't quite understand what's going on, because there are not Allied troops occupying Berlin. There are not Allied troops throughout Germany. So they are under the they are confused. How did we lose? We haven't been occupied. Right? Well, most of this war on the Western Front is not even fought in Germany. Some of it is, but a lot of it's in Belgium and in the French countryside. More of it's in France than any other country on the West. Right? And then, of course, Eastern Germany and Russia, places like that. So there is going to be a certain amount of confusion here as to, from the German perspective, that did we actually lose this war? What happened? Right? Well, the Allies absolutely defeated the German military. It's just that they did it in France more than they did it in Germany. All right? And that's going to be an issue here, because Hitler's going to come along. This guy named Hitler's going to come along and say, we never lost that war. The people who signed this peace treaty, they sold us out. The November criminals, as they're called. We'll talk about them later. So again, there's a little bit of confusion here on the part of the German people. But make no mistake about it, the German military was absolutely defeated by the Allies. It's just that most of it was done in France, where the German army was. All right? Now, when this war is over, peace conference takes place. January of 1919 to June of 1919. 6 month conference. Now, a couple of things I want to point out here. You will read about the Big Four. That is the four major allied nations that are going to be running these negotiations. The United States, England, France, and Italy. Italy is sort of acknowledged, but they're not really going to have a tremendous amount of influence here. So, realistically, it's the big three: the United States, England, and France. Those three countries, the leaders of those three countries, are largely going to determine the outcome of this war. And the outcome of this war is going to create an entirely different Europe from the one that had been when the war began. All right? Now, obviously, when we talk about the big three, Wilson is going to represent the United States. Now, let me talk about this for just a moment here. This is the first time ever that a sitting American president led a diplomatic negotiation. Normally, you would send representatives to do diplomats. Here's Wilson. Now, remember, again, he's this kind of petty individual here, right? If you disagree with him, you're wrong, that kind of guy. He doesn't trust anybody to do this. Only he can do this, okay? This is how he's sort of, I guess, micromanaging the whole thing here. He's really obsessive about this. But he is going to leave the United States and go to Paris to lead the American delegation. Now, a couple of things I want you to keep in mind about this, the context. One, Wilson is in for an eye-opener here. He believes he has more credibility than he's actually going to have. And here's why. When he arrives in France, takes a ship across the Atlantic, Paris is, you got to go across the country for a while to get across France to get to Paris, right? It's not on the coast. So he's taking trains all the way across the French countryside to Paris. And every little town he goes through, thousands of Frenchmen and French kids and girls and boys. I mean, they're cheering on Wilson. We love Wilson, right? They absolutely love this guy. It was very common. Little girls would have necklaces with lockets. And they open it up, and on one side is the Virgin Mary. On the other side is Woodrow Wilson. Right? Now, again, that kind of stuff starts to go to your head. They love me over here, right? Well, yeah, they do love you because the United States provided the resources as well as the troops at the very end of the war to finish this war off, right? So the French people have a big debt of gratitude to the United States here, for sure. And Wilson, as the president, is going to receive a lot of that adulation. But the reality is, politics now, France absolutely needed the United States, as all the Allies did, during the war. The war's over now, and they don't need the United States anymore, right? So Wilson is in for a kind of an eye-opener, because when he is going to lead this American delegation trying to implement the 14 points plan, he's not going to have near as much power and influence as he thought he was going to have. All right? So the tide has changed. In the time of war, yeah, that is exactly right. Wilson was a hero, right? Now that's not as true anymore. Okay? Another very important political development back in the United States is that now remember I said this war was not popular in the United States. We'll get to that side of it either later today or next time. But this was a very unpopular war. And Wilson, in 1918, it was an off-year election, congressional election. And the Republicans won massive majorities in the House and the Senate. And again, that was really a vote against the war and against then the Democrats who were in power in time of war. So the Republicans dominate the midterm elections, Congress and the Senate. Now, Wilson is going to go over and negotiate this settlement, and whatever he negotiates, it doesn't really matter. Who ratifies treaties? Congress, and specifically the Senate. So whatever he does in Paris, he still has to come back and get Republican Senate approval. Now, here, remember what I said? Wilson does not compromise. He's no good at this. He's leading the American delegation to settle this greatest conflict that we've been involved, international conflict we've ever been involved in. And how many Republicans did he bring with him? Zero. None. Not one Republican did he bring with him for the peace negotiations. Right? That's not smart. Right? Whether you like them or not, you need them. They have power. It's about negotiation. It's about compromise. And he can't do it, or is unwilling to do it. Right? And I'll give you just an example of this. Throughout the course, we're going to negotiate. We're going to talk about the details of the conference. But at one point around, I want to say April or so, roughly, he has to come back to the United States for a couple of weeks, take care of some presidential business, and then he's going to come back and finish the conference through June. So he comes back to the United States, and he actually goes to Boston. And his daughter gave birth to his grandson, so there's also, to see his grandson. Well, Boston, Massachusetts, Boston is the home of his greatest political enemy, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. Senator Lodge. And by the way, Lodge runs the Senate. He is the most powerful, influential man in the Senate. If you plan on getting the Senate to ratify the treaty, whatever you're going to negotiate in Paris, he has to be on board. And this is what Wilson said to reporters while he's holding his grandson. And he says this in Lodge's hometown. He said, senators are a lot like babies. Right? They have their eyes shut and their mouths open all the time. That is, they're running their mouth and they can't see what's really going on. Right? So, Lodge is going to remember that. Let me just tell you, Lodge is going to remember that. So again, he's not the brightest politician in terms of political maneuvering. He's a very bright guy, but he's not a very good politician from this perspective. All right, he leads the American delegation. Now, the other one is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George. This is the other of the three big three. The other person of the big three. Now, David Lloyd George, like all of these countries that are come here, again, well over 100 countries participated in this conflict. Something like 1,500 delegates showed up in Paris. But again, it's these three we're talking about here. But they all came to this conference with their national agenda, that is how this is going to affect their nation, front and center. That is, it's the most important. Not international. Wilson's the only one that actually has an international perspective. 14 points. Right? So David Lloyd George comes with England, or Great Britain's, national concerns. And what is England's national concerns? There are two of them. The German Navy and Germany's colonial possessions. Now I'll come back to this in just a moment, but long story short, who gets both of those? Great Britain got both of them, right? Okay, Great Britain got, and from their perspective, mission accomplished. That's what they wanted, right? Now, the other thing that David Lloyd George does do is serve as a kind of a mediator between Wilson, on one hand, and the French president, Georges Clemenceau. Georges Clemenceau. Georges Clemenceau was a fiery personality, very interesting character. He said when he, and I've never been able to explain this correctly, but when he died, he wanted to be not buried, but entombed, I guess, but standing upright, facing Germany. Right? That is to make sure that the Germans know he is still protecting France. Right? Now, it's very interesting. He has an understandable perspective. He wants to crush Germany, absolutely destroy them in any way possible to make sure that Germany never threatens France again. That's his national concern. And again, it is understandable, but it's going to be difficult to implement 14 points plans and international agenda if you have these kind of national vindictive goals, right? But it's understandable. Every time Clemenceau would, issue some sort of an opinion about punishing Germany, he even said, let's break Germany up again, right? They were only formed, back in 1870 when they defeated France, right? And let's break them back up again. That's not going to work. German nationalism had brought Germany together. If you break them up again, you're only sowing the seeds of a future conflict because the German people want to be together in a German nation, as do lots of other cultures in this country, or in this continent as well. So the map's going to look very different in a moment, right? But he said very interestingly, every time somebody challenged him, he said, you're being too hard. You're being too hard. He said, how many men did you lose in this war? Nobody at this conference lost more men than France. 1.7 million. Now, overall, more Russians died in this war, but who's not at this conference? Russia. The Russians are not here. They are not allowed because they quit, right? So they are not allowed to participate in this conference. So he would say every time, how many men did you lose? And that kind of shut everybody up because nobody lost more than France from the Allied perspective, okay, or from the Allied side. So Russia's not even here. Who else is not here? Germany. Now, most of the time when we think about peace negotiations, it's between the winners and the losers. That is not how this is happening. The negotiations are amongst the winners, and whatever they come up with, they will dictate that to Germany. Germany is not allowed to participate in this conference either. They will have to take whatever is given to them from the decisions of this conference. Right? So Wilson, Clemenceau, David Lloyd George. And it's very interesting, Wilson actually wants to show leniency towards Germany. Don't punish them. Don't punish them severely. Clemenceau is always going to do everything he possibly can to hurt Germany. You know, there's just a simple demographic reality that France has to accept. There's nothing they can do about this. Germany is a bigger country than France, which means ultimately there will always be more German soldiers than French soldiers. And that's a demographic reality that he is trying to offset by punishing Germany so much now that they will be so weak that they won't threaten France in the future. Okay? Okay, now, Wilson came to Paris to implement the 14 points plan, but most importantly, the League of Nations. That's his number one agenda. So, how successful was Wilson? If it goes to implementation of the creation of the League of Nations, he was successful. The Europeans accepted the establishment and creation of this international organization designed to prevent future conflicts. You know, again, this whole idea about idealism is oftentimes used to discredit Wilson. Oh, he's an idealist. He doesn't, right? Consider what he's ultimately trying to say here. He said, look, how did we get into this situation, meaning World War I to begin with? Competition, imperialism, industrialization, and if we don't change this situation, what's the chances that another war might break out in the future? Well, World War II is not far away from this, about 20 years, right? So Wilson is saying, if we keep doing the same things, don't expect a different outcome. Future wars are going to come. So he's trying to, again, implement these policies to prevent future conflicts, right? So the League of Nations, this will be accepted by the European nations, and he, very interestingly, usually when you talk about political organizations or international organizations, when you write up the document that sort of outlines all the rules and articles, and usually it's called a constitution or maybe a charter or something like that. He very interestingly called it the covenant of the League of Nations. Now, when you talk about covenants, what's the usual context for that? Religion, absolutely, right? Covenants are usually deals between people and God or something of this nature. There's a religious, sort of spiritual overtone to the term covenant here. And I think that he did that intentionally, right? That is, he's trying to sort of put a little bit of, religion sacredness, I guess, maybe, to this plan, right? Now, and by the way, when we talk about this whole covenant, all the little rules and details and articles and provisions and everything, he wrote all of that himself on a typewriter. He wouldn't even trust his secretaries. He couldn't even dictate it to them. He had to write, again, micromanaging everything. Okay? So when you get to Article 10 of the Covenant, that's where he is talking about collective security. And this is the one major issue here that's going to be a sticking point. But so I'm just referencing it now. Article 10 is where he lays out this plan where if one member of the League is threatened by another aggressive nation, all of the members agree to come to the aid of that country and defend them or punish the aggressive nation. And again, the point is collective security should be a deterrent. It should be a deterrent. If you know you're going to be ganged up on, you might not attack somebody. Right? Now again, there are some details to be worked out here, but it is a very interesting situation here that when we come back to the Congress, the Republicans are going to want to, let's negotiate this just a little bit. Wilson's going to say no. But this is where it came from, Article 10. Now, let me sort of put this up here. In today's United Nations, you have what we call the Security Council. And the Security Council is made up, and this is, in League of Nations, it's called the Executive Council, but it does the same thing. This is basically the body of the League of Nations that will decide the policies or the agenda for the League as a whole, whether or not it even can go to a vote for all members, right? So if whatever is decided everything has to be agreed upon in the Executive Council before it could then go to any kind of a vote to all members, right? And like the United Nations today, and the Security Council, this is weighted to favor certain countries against other countries. So 5 permanent seats: the United States, England, France, Italy, and Japan. So each of these countries will have a permanent representative on the Executive Council. All right? Now, the Council is made up of 9 seats. Not coincidence. The other 4 are going to rotate. Right? So you'll have 5 permanent seats and 4 rotating seats. And what is the purpose of that 5 to 4? So they can always outvote those other 4, right? So again, this is still weighted in favor of the big 3, but the big 5. All these 5 are on the same side. So the point is that if there is some sort of a situation where a member of the League is attacked by somebody and the decision has to go before the League of Nations how to respond to that, it comes out of the Executive Council. So all of these 5 permanent seats also get to do something the other 4 don't. They have a veto vote. So they can veto any decision coming out of the Executive Council if they choose to, right? Just like the United Nations today, right? So 5 permanent seats: U.S., England, France, Italy, and Japan. Now, if we want to just on the very basic level ask, was he successful in implementing the League of Nations? He was. But the League of Nations was one of 14 points. The other 13, flat rejected by the Europeans. None of them will be accepted. There's no way England is going to vote for end of colonialism. Right? There's no way that these countries making so much money industrial manufacturing of weapons because it's going to reduce armaments. Right? There's just no way that these policies are going to be implemented if they consider their national agenda. So Wilson is absolutely beside himself that he was only able to establish the League of Nations. Everything else was flat rejected. And notice, too, that is also the context that he feels like, I had to give away everything. All I could get was the League of Nations. So when he comes back to the Senate to ratify this thing, from his perspective, I'm not compromising any longer with anybody, right? Because he felt like he was forced to do that at the Paris Peace Conference. Okay, so the League of Nations is just one aspect of the overall issues here, as we've already sort of indicated. Excuse me. What about Germany? All right, that is, let's go back to the whole point of the conference here is how are we going to deal with Germany? Now, I've already sort of indicated this. Wilson wants to show them leniency. Clemenceau wants to destroy them, to punish them, right? So again, why? Well, first of all, I don't know if I wrote this down or not. I didn't. So hold on, before you do that, let me just explain to you what happened in Germany at the end of this war. And I don't have this on the slide, so I'll spell this for you. But the Kaiser, William II, he's gone. He's in exile. He abandoned the throne, and he went to Holland, and so he's gone. He quit. The German High Command, that is the military, they have been defeated, and they are now gone as well. They're no longer in power in Germany. So what is going on in Germany? That is, what government exists in Germany that can sign whatever is about to be negotiated here, this Treaty of Versailles, which I'll get to just the treaty in just a moment. So what happened in Germany is a new government is created. And I don't have this written down, but it's called the Weimar government. And the way you spell that is W-E-I-M-A-R. W-E-I-M-A-R. I'll adjust the slide here when I post it. But in German it's pronounced like a V. So the Weimar government. W-E-I-M-A-R. It's the town of Weimar, and this is where representatives all came. And this Weimar government, this is why this is important to know. They're democratic. It's a republic. All right? This isn't even the parliamentary system that they'd had before. This is a republican form of government. That is, it is a democracy. And what was Wilson's major goal here? To make the world safe for democracy. If you punish Germany excessively, and yeah, there's accountability, but it's about excess. If you so punish them that they don't recover from this, then you are weakening the chance for real democracy to form in Germany, right? And that was Wilson's goal, to have Germany to have democracy spread throughout the world. So what he's saying to Clemenceau is, this government, the Weimar government, is not the government of the Kaiser. This is not that former government so militaristic. So let's help them so that they can survive and spread democracy. Clemenceau doesn't want to hear any of that. Crush them. All right. So the overall peace treaty that comes out of these negotiations is called the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles. This is a suburb of Paris. This is the big palace back in the 17th century with Louis XIV. Interestingly enough, when Germany went to war with France back in that Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and out of that they were born as a nation, where did they declare the establishment of Germany? In the Palace of Versailles. So again, this is kind of fitting. So the Treaty of Versailles, treaties are usually assigned the title of the city that you sign them in. So that's why it's the Treaty of Versailles. This is where it took place, outside of Paris. First and foremost, Germany's going to lose territory. They're going to lose a lot of territory. And I'm not talking about colonial possessions. I'm talking about Germany itself is going to lose territory. Okay? So what territory do they lose? They lose the territory on the French-German border called Alsace and Lorraine. Now, Alsace and Lorraine are sort of political volleyballs. They kind of get kicked. Whoever, if the Germans win, they take them. If the French win, they take them. They kind of keep going back and forth, back and forth. But now the lines will shift, and Alsace and Lorraine will go from Germany to France, all right, where they had been before that Franco-Prussian War back in 1870. Now, I'll show you on the map, and then I'll come back to this, so if you're writing down, that's okay. But let me just show you. This is the war. This is the map before the war, 1914. And Alsace and Lorraine are right here. So you see how this line kind of goes in like that? Excuse me. Sorry, over here. Sorry. Over here, right? Here's Germany and France. See how it kind of indents like that a little bit? And here's the war afterwards. Okay? It indents a lot more like that. So they draw the boundary so that Alsace and Lorraine are not part of France. Okay? So this is territory that goes to France. Notice this green area right in here, that Rhine River, the Rhineland, right? The Rhineland is also a major issue here to think about. Now Germany in this particular instance doesn't lose the Rhineland. It's still going to be part of Germany. But the Rhineland is demilitarized, meaning no German troops are allowed to be in this part of Germany, the Rhineland. And again, I'll show you a map. So, right, there's the Rhineland. It's that green area, right? This is the Rhine River, right in here. And all of this area, now this is in Germany. But Germany is not allowed to have any troops in this area. And why? Because Clemenceau said he wants to create a buffer zone here, right? So that if Germany, this is the staging ground for the invasion of Belgium into France at the beginning of the war. So at best, if no German troops are there, then in the future, if Germany begins to amass an army there, France can respond to that more quickly. All right. So it was a way to kind of create a buffer zone. Now, at the beginning, at the end of the war here, there are Allied troops occupying the Rhineland for the next 15 years. There will be Allied troops there, but not throughout Germany, just in the Rhineland itself. But it is supposed to be demilitarized, meaning no German troops are allowed in this territory. All right. Germany lost all of their colonial possessions. Their empire is gone. Now, it's interesting how they worded this, and you can see England involved in this completely. They don't say, well, England just gets them. Nobody ever just says that, right? But the phrasing of this was that the closest colonial power next to one of these German colonies, that is, whatever colony is closest to Germany's colonies, whoever controlled the other colony, they take possession. Well, who is that? That's England, right? But so again, it's a very interesting sort of way to say England gets all of them. Right? And by the way, as I said, the German Navy is also going to be taken possession over by the English as well. A lot of it is going to be scuttled. They'll destroy a lot of it, but a lot of it is going to be re-outfitted and make the British Royal Navy even larger. Now, this last one is perhaps the most painful for Germany itself. This is called I didn't write it on here, but it's called the War Guilt Clause of the treaty, the War Guilt. Because basically, Germany is made to take the responsibility of starting this war. It's their fault. All right? And because it's their fault, right? Remember, reparations, two things. One, admittance of wrongdoing, and then you have to make compensation. So Germany is forced to pay $500 million to the Allies for the next 66 years.
$500 million or 33 billion?
33 billion over 66 years, so $500 million a year for 66 years. But yeah, total $33 billion. $500 million for each year for 66 years. So this is the one that is going to really be able to be exploited by Hitler later on.
Didn't they just finish paying not that long ago? Because during the World War II they stopped paying, so...
Yes, they have. In fact, it's not only that, but there are a number of financial ramifications that are just now coming to fruition, or coming to completion. Not only is that the case, but also remember all of that debt that the Allies have to the United States, that is war loans to fight the war itself. Well, we issued all that stuff, so we made sure we get our money back. That's why we're on the side of the Allies here. But very interestingly, throughout the 1920s, the Allies are paying us back. But what happened in the 1930s? Great Depression, and they defaulted on all those loans. We ended up losing that money anyway. Yeah, but yeah, this is going to be one of these. They'll stagger and restructure these payments for and Germany is just now finishing this up, right? Years and years later. So Germany is to blame for the war. It's all their fault. Now, understandably, again, if you win the war, you get to dictate the terms of the peace treaty. And I've never met anybody that lost a war and liked the terms of the treaty forced upon them. That's just the way it goes, right? So there is legitimacy here in the sense of the Allies won, they dictate the terms. But you can get a sense that this isn't exactly fair, and I know that life is not fair, but when you punish your enemy excessively, don't be surprised if your enemy comes back later with a revenge sort of mentality here, and that's exactly what Hitler will do 20 years from now, amongst other, and I'm not saying this leads directly to World War II. It's much more complicated than that. But this is one of these little points here that Hitler will be able to exploit by saying, we never lost this war. The Weimar government, which is what he's going to try to get rid of down the road and take over, it was the November criminals, those guys that sold us out on Armistice Day. They're responsible. We never lost this war, right? So this is going to dictate a very harsh penalty to Germany that will be resurrected later in terms of creating hostility against the Allies, the West, from Germany's perspective. All right, we are out of time. I will finish this up. We got to remember, Wilson still has to come back and sell this to the Senate. That's a whole nother story.